You are listening to the Push Media Podcast Network.
It's time for a headliner. You've heard him on the Joe Rogan podcast, you've read about him in the Rolling Stones, and you've seen him on Netflix. God damn! Tim Dillon, everybody!
Me and Colin look like we were raised in the same family. People that love Wendy's chicken sandwiches. And Donald Trump. Like if me and Colin are brothers, we know one thing. Our mother loves Donald Trump and spicy chicken nuggets at Wendy's.
A friend of mine that has a podcast, let's just call it the Ball and Boyle podcast, came to me with a problem that happened to him recently. After I heard his problem, I gave him my advice, and my advice included a quote from the great Katharine Drexel. Believe it or not, that's what I hit him with. And the quote I told my friend who was suffering this problem that just happened to him, I said, "Friend, let me tell you what Katharine Drexel once said. Quote, while imitation may be the highest form of flattery, it is also the quickest way to get your pale Irish weathered bell rung, Jack." End quote. So what this friend told me that made me tell him this quote was that he had a podcast. He had a podcast that, was good sometimes, was bad sometimes, but at least it was uniquely his, because he was a specific type of fool. Certainly a fool. A clown, a jester, a nincompoop. But a guy who was at least mildly amusing. And this guy had a friend who had a podcast himself, which was significantly bigger than the Ball and Boyle podcast. But Ball and Boyle goes on to tell me that the podcast that he was a fan of, a podcast that he liked, one could even say he was inspired to start his own because of this one. He had a sneaky suspicion that somehow this podcast had come to, in no simpler terms than this, jack his shit. And unique shits, very specific to him shits. Do you ever have that happen to you? You ever have a friend come up to you and say, "Hey, I have a podcast, but this way more successful podcast is stealing all of my ideas. What should I do?" I tell that friend it's very simple. This is what Katharine Drexel said. But before I, tell him maybe we have to ring his bell, explain why you think that's the case. Because these are big claims. These are salacious things to say about somebody. So he goes on to point out a few examples. First being, my friend Ball and Boyle just did a podcast explaining in-depthly, in his opinion, I don't know, I haven't listened, but maybe I should. If you're interested, check it out. There's a link below. About the death penalty and how it is, in principle, a terrible idea. While on that podcast, he also brings up Ghislaine Maxwell, whose trial is, starting, but nobody's fucking talking about. And my friend Ball and Boyle, who's a nincompoop, he thinks he's doing some good. He thinks he's following things and reporting in a way that's amusing just enough to get the average person listening. So he comes up with some funny nicknames, amusing epitaphs as he goes about the story. So instead of Ghislaine, he calls her Jizzy Lane, because that's hilarious. Jizzy, like jizz. Anyway, so that's just the first example. But that could also, I tell Ballin, that could be an example of parallel thinking. Who's to say that this successful podcast host heard you call Ghislaine Jizzy Lane? That could be parallel thinking. That's low-hanging fruit if we're being honest with ourselves. He says, fair. I have another example. And I say, try me. And then Ballin tells me, Colin, do you remember Schoolhouse Rock videos? To which I say, of course. Who does not remember the days of Schoolhouse Rock? Early animation that had every bit of education you would ever possibly need to be a functioning, well-educated American citizen. Specifically including how our government works. I say, Ballin, of course I remember Schoolhouse Rock videos. Who could forget Bill and his song? To which Ballin says, of course I forgot you were a Schoolhouse Rock. You were a Schoolhouse Rock enthusiast, a fan. I forgot you had a book sock. And then he points out most people forget that Schoolhouse Rock was a thing. No one remembers the song. And then Ballin starts singing to me. I'm just a Bill. Yeah, I'm only a Bill. And then naturally I finish and say, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. And it dawns on me Everyone knows that song, but I couldn't even start the song without having someone bring it to me first. But once I heard it, obviously, almost instinctually, I had an out-of-body experience and knew to finish the song. But someone had to point it out to me first. But then once you do, like a Pavlov dog, all of a sudden you're just yelling, "Why don't ya?" You know. So I say fair. Interesting point, Ballin. Do you have any more? And then the real plot twist is Ballin goes on to tell me that this successful podcast host not only mentions principally a very recent and similar argument and detailed, nuanced, complex breakdown of the death penalty, he also affectionately refers to Ghislaine Maxwell as Jizzy Lane Maxwell, and brings up Bill from the Schoolhouse Rock videos of everyone's childhood that everyone forgot, but they know the second they hear the song, all in the same episode. On top of that, he recorded the episode in his car, which is something I know Ballin is known to do while he waits for his new studio to be built down in Austin, Texas, because I'm really betting on Ballin's podcast. So I tell Ballin, well, shit, you do make a convincing case. Now, I say, Ballin, how did this happen? What do you think first originally piqued the interest? How could you correlate these two? What would be the bridge that connects these salacious claims that this wildly successful podcast / Patreon show is continually liberally borrowing your concepts? He tells me that the podcast producer of his show originally provoked this loudmouth, blow-hearted buffoon on Twitter, got in a wonderful exchange, and then revealed that he played the guy. Because, you know, loudmouth blowhards on Twitter are very easy to manipulate. Now, but they're also, if they're a little bit smart, and obviously this guy would be if he has a wildly successful Patreon that makes nearly $200,000 a month, yet he has no family to spend Thanksgiving with. Now, all of a sudden, there's a link and there's a motivation. But there's probably a little vindictiveness. You probably feel a little tight that you were played for a fool. Let me check out this kid's podcast. Oh, some of these ideas are similar. Jizzy's kind of funny. You get it? Because, you know, Jizz. I say, Ballin, dear God, you're being exploited by one of the most successful podcasts on Patreon. How do we take legal action? Who do we call? Who do we need on our legal staff, on our legal team? Who did OJ have? So I felt a little bad for Ballin. On Thanksgiving, a holiday that is supposed to represent everybody getting along, sides coming together over what's common and shared about them. Not exploiting, but giving and mutually benefiting. If you're a Native American, you got some corn. And you're like, hey, Pilgrim, we got corn. Pilgrim's like, hey, we got shoes with buckles on them. Because, you know, Pilgrims had an excess of buckles. They had so many buckles, they put them on their fucking hats. And then you would trade. Now you got corn, they got shoes. Nobody has to slaughter one group until you're forced to live on reservations. You would think. But just like the original Thanksgiving, and what has happened, a grotesque version of it that we've come to know today and blame Christopher Columbus for, I think still not positive if that's Columbus Day or Thanksgiving. Point is, somebody's head was cut off and made a centerpiece on that first Thanksgiving in Massachusetts or something. And fast forward to 2021, my friend Ballin, who's running a podcast, chasing down dreams, snapping necks, cashing checks, kissing babies, rolling up in stretch limousines, woo! Just when he was catching heat, his head was cut off by the corporate shill of Patreon, sucking vampirically his conceptual ideas that make him a person because he's hungry. They cut Colin, his head off, put it on a table, and said, let's eat. And I said, Ballin, before we go public with these claims, let me talk about it first publicly. But also, we got to really line up our ducks in a row before we start throwing around names. I mean, look at Corey Haim. Point is, do you want to be Corey Haim or do you want to be the other Corey? Actually, I didn't say that. That doesn't make any fucking sense. Both of them are terrible outcomes. Point is, support original thought, I guess. Don't steal people's ideas. Especially don't steal people's ideas. And this is just a thought here. Just because you're a little salty, you're a little fucking much. You can't turn it down. You can't just fucking a little less. Because if you're always on too much, I hate to use a car analogy, but if you rev an engine too much, eventually you have nobody to spend Thanksgiving with. So I said, Ballin, wait, see, and then maybe put it out, use his name, and see if you could start a war on Twitter just to get some more listens. But in the meantime, Ballin, just keep it bull, bomb, and belected. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Yeah, because not everyone can. Oh, yeah. Fuck Tim